Greetings from Seattle, Washington, in the heart of the great Pacific Northwest. I'm Jason Rigdon, and you are listening to the Podcast of Mystery, the show that always leaves you with more questions than answers. The podcast where I talk with extraordinary guests about the paranormal, the strange, and the unknown. On this episode, I will be talking with Andy Gell about one of the most mysterious groups in musical history, the Justified Ancients of Moo. But first, I just want you to tell a friend about the Podcast of Mystery. I don't have cash to buy ads, so I depend on my listeners to spread the word about this show. So please tell a friend about the Podcast of Mystery.
My name's Andy Gell. I come from the middle of England, city called Nottingham. And since 2017, I've been involved in various projects, writing projects, performance projects in and around the return of the band that's more commonly known or more popularly known as the KLF.
And I don't suppose you could give us a little bit of I know it's a rather large subject, but a brief introduction to this band.
Yeah, so the KLF will probably go in our history as one of the most mysterious bands or music acts to ever top the charts. Back in 1991, they were the biggest selling singles band in the world, but 5 years later they were almost completely forgotten, disappeared completely from the map. You couldn't buy the records anywhere. You couldn't stream their music at all up until very, very recently. That's been a recent turn of events. But when they disappeared, they rather enigmatically said that they return in 23 years. And 23 years later, they did exactly that, with an event in August of 2017 where they returned to the very second, 23 years later, since they'd earned £1 million, which was the last of their royalties from their music ventures.
And so what did you personally find so attractive about this band?
It's very, very difficult to pinpoint, really. I think more than any other group, they created a very, very convincing mythology. They borrowed from lots of other existing mythologies. The original name of the band and the title they still go under would be the Justified Ancients of Moo, who is the name of a sort of terrorist organisation in Robert Anton Wilson's Illuminatus trilogy. Now, that mythology in itself that comes with that set of books is a big factor on a lot of the things they did, but so many of the things that they got up to in a relatively short span, 5 years from start to finish, they were in and around. So each and every one of some of the things they were involved in would be a notable achievement for any band, really. But cramming all of their things that they've managed, and then 23 years later, come back with the bombshell that they've come back with is quite fascinating.
And you mentioned that they burned some money a number of years ago. Could you tell us a little bit about that? That's quite an interesting endeavor.
Yeah. I think it works best, if you give a bit of a background to the events leading up to it, because even though when it was announced to the world, it was out of nowhere, sort of going back through the preceding years, you can definitely see a sort of sequence of events. So in 1992, at the Brit Awards, which is the British equivalent of the Grammys, they won the Best Group Award and were asked to start the show, kick off the show as the main act. They came on stage to record their big hit single, 3 AM Eternal, but this time they were backed by an extreme metal band who were called Extreme Noise Terror. And having finished a quick 2.5 minute run through their hit single, which sounded nothing like the record that they made, an announcer declared that the KLF had left the music business. The lead singer produced a machine gun from underneath his leather jacket and sprayed the audience with blanks. And then they left. So this was right at the start of the show. So when later on in the show they were announced as Best Group, they hadn't gone. They weren't there. They'd already officially left the music industry. And so they had to quickly send a motorcycle courier over to pick up their award. So they were already renowned for a few pranks and a few things like this. So a lot of people didn't really believe that would be the end of them. But then a few months later, they announced that they'd become a art foundation called the K Foundation, but rather quickly just declared that people were to await further instructions and that nothing was forthcoming for another sort of couple of years, until there's a big modern art prize in the UK called the Turner Prize, and lots of very famous artists have won it quite early on in their career. And this was the moment the K Foundation decided they wanted to really get involved in the art world. So they announced the inaugural K Foundation Prize, which would go to the worst example of modern art in that year. Now, it just so happened that the winner of the Turner Prize, it was called Rachel Whiteread. She also won the K Foundation Prize for the worst award. And that award of £40,000 was nailed to a canvas, and they waited outside the award ceremony to present it to her. And she refused to come out because she didn't want to get involved in people hijacking her big moment and making publicity off the awards. So she refused to go out, and they said, okay, but we've got the money. If you don't come for it, we're just going to burn it. And she says, no, don't do it. And you got to understand a lot of people that were involved in this modern art prize were going, actually, that's quite an interesting concept, the fact that there's this money here that's about to be awarded to an artist, but if she doesn't take it, it's going to be burnt. And the sort of spies have been out and said, yes, they've doused the money in petrol, and they seem very keen to do it. So at the very last minute, they went out and, she went out and accepted the soaking wet in petrol banknotes and went back inside. Shortly after that, the K Foundation announced a whole series of art pieces, which involved various denominations of money nailed to canvases. And the main centerpiece of the exhibition was £1 million in cash in £1,000 bundles nailed to a canvas, a large canvas. And the idea this would be something that an art dealer could buy, and it was £1 million worth of cash, but its list price was £500,000. So the idea was somebody could buy it immediately and sell it and instantly make £500,000 back, or they could buy it and wait to see if the value of the art appreciated above the £1 million that they paid. But at this point, the art world was still very, very skeptic about this, and nobody would touch it. No galleries would, first of all, insure themselves enough to hold this piece of work. So they just had this huge piece of work with £1 million nailed to it and nowhere for it to go. And the thing about paper is it's quite burny. So the more and more they thought about what they were going to do with this work that nobody wanted, this idea crystallized. And then one morning they got on a plane to an island just off the northwest coast of Scotland to do something. They weren't quite sure yet still at this point. And then just after midnight on August 23rd, 1994, they got up, walked to a small boathouse on the shores of the lake, lit a fire, and over the next couple of hours threw £1 million in £50 notes into the fire. It was filmed on a very, very cheap and nasty camcorder that was just dropped on the floor and filmed. And that was the only document of it, really. And at that point then, that was their final sort of statement on leaving the music industry. Because I think they'd gone into things, they'd both come from sort of quite punk rock, new wave backgrounds. So I think the idea was they always wanted to be agent provocateurs of the music industry, shall we say. But when they eventually became so successful and this huge singles selling band, winning best brand at the Brits, I think their mission had kind of failed. They felt that this acceptance they were getting was not what they'd set out to do. So this was like a final sort of cleansing, really, of all the money that they'd made from the music industry. And then that's it. They just disappeared after 23 years. They deleted all their records. You couldn't buy them anywhere. Radio stations couldn't play the records anymore. There was nobody collecting royalties or anything like that. And then over this course of the next 5 or 6 years, they just sort of disappeared. There were people in the sort of next generation along that had no idea, really, that for that very short period of time that they were huge, and then it just disappeared.
How did their fans react? You know, they were a very popular band, a group, and then with the burning the money and the disappearing, that must have been hard for some of their fans to take. Or was this part of being a fan of these folks?
Yeah, I think expecting the unexpected was always something that came with them. But this was sort of very, very, very early days of the internet and things. So there was not really a fan community that might be for a group these days. It was just, that's a bit odd. And with nothing to, apart from the odd bit in the weekly music magazines and papers, there was nothing much to deal with, really. It was just a case of, I've got some records, that's it. Wasn't that a bit odd? And then right at the start of 2017, a single mysterious poster appeared under a railway bridge in London, just announcing that they had been working solidly for 23 years on something, and they were ready to come back and show the world, really. And they were going to do it to an audience of only 400 people over the course of 3 days up in Liverpool, with the ticket price being £100. And the condition was that all ticket holders would be, in quotes, volunteers. And that was as much information as people got, really. So it was a real leap of faith to buy a ticket and go along.
What happened at this event?
An awful lot. So towards the end of their sort of pop career, they were very good at sort of taking something and making it ultimate or instantly iconic. So in one of their last singles, Justified and Ancient, which was their song with country and western legend Tammy Wynette, they had customised an ice cream van. And as everybody waited outside a bookshop in Liverpool, which is where they were going to do the first part of the return, just after midnight, these distant ice cream van chimes came around the corner, and there they were, sort of surrounded by what had become, even though there's only 400 people, actually with tickets, there were probably about 2,000 people at midnight in this small side street in Liverpool, just mobbing this ice cream van. And then over the course of the 3 days, an awful lot it was they were there, but other people were sort of acting as their sort of surrogates and whatever. They were there sort of observing, they were there sort of moving things along. But ultimately it was, this only really became clear until sort of weeks afterwards, that the audience were, the ticket holders were the thing that was being created was very much around the audience. So there were various jobs issued to people, which all seemed, in isolation, all seemed very, very odd. So it was somebody's job to go out and collect shopping carts and bring them to an area, a building in just outside Liverpool, when people were given the job of collecting very particular weeds that might be growing at the side of the road, and sort of to collect a refuse sack full of weeds. And all these odd jobs just didn't seem to make any sense to anybody that had them, until they formed the sort of greater whole, which was on the final day. And on that final day, after a huge procession involving the the shopping carts and the bags of weeds and everything else that everybody had collected, they announced that they had gone into the funeral business and were planning to build what they call the People's Pyramid, which is quite simple. They take a specially formulated house brick with a couple of holes in the top. They take 23 grams of your ashes. They put that inside the brick, break the brick, and then once a year they add it to a pyramid, which they intend to be 23 feet high and finish construction at some point in the next century.
Wow. Have they begun construction on it yet?
Yes. So sadly, some people passed away within the first year of it being announced, and they'd signed up. And in the first year, it was the brother of Jimmy Corty, who is one half of the KLF. His brother had passed away a couple of years earlier, and it was always his wish for some of his ashes to be baked into a brick. So he was the sort of very first stone. After the second year, there were, I think, 8 or 9 bricks added. Last year didn't happen because of COVID, but I imagine when it comes back again this year in November, it will be sort of 20 or 30 bricks high. But the idea is it's going to ultimately take 34,592 bricks, which is going to take a while.
So what other plans do they have for the future, or is this their main kind of focus right now, this pyramid?
Yeah, I mean, they're both in the sort of approaching the twilight of their years. They're still very, very active in the various art and music things that are involved. Completely to surprise everybody, really, they decided at the start of 2021 that they were going to make at least some of their music available again through streaming platforms. I think on their part, I think there was a desire to have some kind of legacy that they pass on to their children. So bit by bit, some of their back catalogue is being released through streaming platforms. But then this all sort of centres ultimately once a year around what they call the Toxteth Day of the Dead. Toxteth is the area of Liverpool where the pyramid's being constructed. 23rd November of a year, there are various events and activities culminating in the laying of the bricks that have been baked that year.
So looking at this group, it's kind of confusing and dazzling. Do you have any ways of helping us understand maybe their motivations and why they do these things?
That is a very interesting question because Bill Drummond, who is the other main man of the KLF, he was once asked something similar like that, like, why do you do this? And his answer was, if they knew why, they wouldn't be doing it. At a distance, if you look back over their career, you can kind of trace a very slow trajectory from the very beginnings. I mean, there's always been a pyramid on the logo. That a lot of that came, I think, from Rob Attington Wilson's book. But in retrospect, you can look back and go, "Oh, yeah, they always had this in mind." I don't think they did, but I think one of their major strengths is taking these seemingly random events and have people create a narrative out of them.
And what do you think drives your personal interest in the group?
Just I think it's certainly refreshing. It's a group that how old would I be when I was 17, I think, when they first came along. Having a huge gap that long, I don't think they're ever forgotten by people that knew them back then, but it was quite a nice surprise to be sort of in my late 40s and all of a sudden this group that I loved sort of this long ago had come back, and what they were doing was oh yeah, I'm going to get to the age where I've started to think about end of life plans and funeral arrangements. And in terms of a target audience, a lot of their audience is of a similar sort of age. And I think what they're doing, that they're not making music anymore, but what they are doing is carrying something on in a similar spirit, I think.
And if I'm correct, their work has inspired you to create art also.
Yeah, I think in the weeks and months after that event in August 2017, everybody who was there just seemed to be affected by some sort of desire to do something more. It felt like this can't just be the end of it. These 3 days just can't be the end of it. And I'd always been a big fan of the Illuminatus trilogy. And I just had this idea that I've never written before, really. I just had this idea that wouldn't be interesting if the two detectives from the Illuminatus trilogy looked at the events of 2017 through a similar sort of prism as the original book and went, oh, this is interesting, what's going on. And then I sort of wrote a sort of narrative around the events in Liverpool, but with a huge dose of satire on conspiracy theories and whatnot. And the events in the book follow, a true life pattern, but what's happening behind the scenes is sort of lots of very outlandish conspiracy theories. I think the original premise of the Illuminatus trilogy was what would happen if all of the conspiracy theories of the 60s and 70s were true. And I just sort of went, oh, well, if that was still something today, we've got new and improved conspiracy theories at the moment. And what if somebody tried to link all those back to this event there? So that was my first book, which was called Whatever, which I wrote just to get it off my chest, really, but was very, very popular. So a follow-up had to come, which were called Together. And then when you've written one book that begins with W, one begins with T, you kind of have to, by law, have to follow that with an F book. So Forever was the third book in that trilogy. And each time with each book, I kind of pull back a little bit further from the inspiration of the KLF and the Jams, but still try and build on some of the mythology that was there in the first place.
And do you have plans for continuing the story or writing more? You said you hadn't really written before.
So the third book, Forever in the trilogy, ended up being a trilogy itself. So there's been 5 books over the course of 3 years. That particular chapter is at an end, but I'm still carrying on writing. It's been difficult to write over the last year. I think it's the surreal nature of things. It's like it's beyond fiction, really. And I didn't want to write a pandemic book at all, really. So various things have just been on the back burner since then.
So I hope this question doesn't sound too pretentious. I feel like art kind of helps us deal with things, and oftentimes with the trauma. Do you have any thoughts about how artistically we will deal with what's happened in 2020?
That's interesting. I think the best art will come 3 or 4, maybe 10 years down the line, really. I don't think, look at things like September 11th. I think I remember very, very quickly after that, there was a Bruce Springsteen album came out, which one of my favourite things, one of the last good things I think he did, really. But I think what I was surprised by was something like that it wasn't seized upon. First of all, there's not really been a sort of Titanic version of the September 11th story, thank goodness. But I think Hollywood would probably champion a bit to do that, but they never did. But I think if you look at maybe the like the Marvel universe, I think a lot of the things that happen in that, like the you look at a movie, a Superman movie, an Avengers movie. There's lots and lots of destruction of cities, which I think the seeds of that came from that event. It's odd because there's been so many, for the last 10, 15 years, look at things like Walking Dead. The television has been warming up for the apocalypse for quite some time. And I think because Stephen King's Stand book was an adaptation of that, just ready to go when COVID hit. But I think one thing that will really come out of the other side of this is just the sort of the different types of networks that people develop, and things like Zoom and things like working remotely and collaborating remotely and working on projects remotely. I think that's something that the technology was there before, but people didn't really know or use it or feel comfortable with it. But I think now that's the lasting legacy of it, I think. And also how strange it will be to go to concerts again with 10,000 people. I think it will be between my last gig and the next one will be about 18 months, which is a huge amount of time. But I imagine there'll be quite emotional experiences for a lot of people when they first go back there.
Yeah, totally. What do you think are some of the lessons we can learn from this kind of a KLF endeavor? I'm not sure what I should call it because it's more than just music.
Yeah. I think something that's at the heart of what they do, particularly now, is sort of community projects, and how a group of people just giving them the right to do something, sort of a granting of permission and just going, yeah, it's fine, I'm gonna go away and do that. So many of the things that happened in Liverpool back in 2017, it was like, okay, today we're going to do this, but how you interpret that is completely down to you. And I think I think the legacy is so many people have gone, oh, actually, yeah, I can do that. Going back to the punk rock days of, here's one chord, here's another chord, now go form a band. It's kind of, it's similar to that, but with a much broader brief, taking in, literature, music, writing, all sorts of things really that have come from this one place. And there's definitely an undercurrent of a counterculture developing in this country through what we call the Arts Lab movement, which are essentially non-artists, but people getting together that wanted to do something that, well, I can do this, well, I can do this, well, I can do that. Well, that's interesting. Together we could do this. So that's something that the Arts Labs were quite a big deal back in the 60s and early 70s, but then sort of died away. But since this event, it seems to have been a catalyst for these Arts Labs to crop up in a lot of major cities. And there's a sort of a friendly rivalry between these Arts Labs. Well, we're doing this, do you want to do something in response to that? And I think it's really interesting to see where that goes.
So some of the people listening, I mean, I really wasn't very familiar with the group. Do you have any advice for maybe how people should be kind of introduced to the group? Maybe how would you go about approaching it?
It would be an awful lot to take in one go. Spotify and other streaming services have got sort of limited amounts of their back catalogue, but there is a terrific, incredibly readable, incredibly non-put-downable book by an author called John Higgs, it's Higgs, that puts their whole story in the context of many other interesting stories. And the music they did is great, and a lot of it is incredibly timeless. But I would say get that book. It's just called The KLF, Chaos and Magic, and the Band That Burnt £1 Million. It's a great read, also a great audiobook. Read that, and then you'll be ready and primed for whatever comes next.
You said that you incorporated conspiracy theories into your work personally. We live in a weird time right now. A lot of conspiracy theories are a big topic, and a lot of people think that they're dangerous and that, they've had a lot of bad influences. Do you have any thoughts on kind of conspiracy theories in the time we're in right now?
The writer and comic writer Alan Moore said something which really resonates about conspiracy theories, and he said they tend to spring up from people's desire to have a story that explains what's going on, and whether that's a shadowy organisation behind the scenes or all these sorts of things. But he said, the reality of it is much scarier than that. The reality is that nobody's pulling the strings, and it is just this random course of history, events of history taking their course, really. I enjoy a conspiracy theory, but only in terms of its inventiveness. And it's like, you didn't just take that and then take that from it and surmise that out of it. But, if you take them at face value as, okay, that's an interesting way to look at it, but I'm just gonna part that there. I think there's nothing too wrong with them. If you've got major politicians encouraging it, I think that's another story altogether.
Well, it's been a fascinating conversation. If people want to learn more about you, where should they go?
Twitter's probably the best place, where I'll sort of discuss projects and things like that. My books are on Amazon. So it's Andy Gell, which is Gell. They're also available through Bandcamp at a much better rate, which keeps money away from Amazon. So I'll give you some links that you can add on into the show.
Well, thank you so much for your time today. I really, really appreciate it. It's been fascinating.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
I'm Jason Rigdon, and you have been listening to episode number 23 of the podcast of Mystery, originally transmitted on
Thursday, July 22nd, 2021.
If you want more information about me, this show, or my guests, please visit podcastofmystery.com. If you have a guest or a topic that you would like to hear on this show, please email podofmystery@gmail.com. You can also send any feedback or comments to that same address. This audio program is copyrighted by me, Jason Rigdon, in 2021, and is freely available under the Creative Commons Attribution License. And don't forget to leave the Podcast of Mystery a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts. Thank you so much for listening.